The story with this album is that mixing this live album actually broke this lineup apart. They asked Dio to leave because Tony and Geezer were mixing things at nighttime, and Ronnie James Dio and then drummer Vinny Appice were coming in the daytime, and they felt that Ronnie was taking over the process. And so kind of passive aggressively, according to Ronnie in the book, we're like, well, we kind of want Tony to take over here. And the original mix has a lot of issues. Like the crowd sounds like it's not there, basically. They kind of like gave keyboard player Jeff Nichols short shrift. It was one of those cases where they have the keyboard player like hidden from the crowd, which is obnoxious, I think, and unnecessary. I hate it when bands do that. It's just so like overly image conscious, and just it's not like you're not hearing the keyboards. So there's that. There's also the fact that they were playing a very predictable suite. Not a suite. It wasn't like they like mixed it into a medley or anything, but they're playing a very predictable set of their earlier classics, almost like a greatest hits, which I think, why would you do that? And I just, for the most part, I feel very resistant to Dio singing Ozzy's material, not on principle, but there's something about it that just doesn't gel for me, except towards the end of this record, it starts to win me over. I think that the record always showed drummer Vinny Appice. It always almost featured him. Like I had always thought of him as a way more kind of ham-fisted drummer than Bill Ward. Way too direct. Not enough subtlety. Not enough of the intangibles that made Bill Ward one of my favorite drummers ever. But I really, really like how both of these mixes actually showcase him. Just the timbre of his drums, it just sits very nicely within everything, and it's not only powerful, but it's you can really hear the tone of his, and almost the way they're tuned as well, which I really, really like. I have never been in love with the way Dio interacts with the crowd on this record. It just doesn't quite connect with me. So there's that. The new mix, again, it's more clear. It's more sort of ferocious sounding. The crowd is louder, but where the old mix had the guitar and the bass just panned up the middle, the new mix then pans the guitar and the bass, and so the bass still really isn't much more present, and so it's like this empty space on one side of the stereo field, which I think was a big mistake. It wasn't really necessary to do it that way. They could have just left it almost in mono, except for the drums, and it would have sounded really, really cool. They could have reined things in, not technically mono, and they could have had a little bit of a spread, but it didn't need to be this wide. I thought that was an overcompensation, and I don't understand from a mixing perspective why you would do that. However, with all that said, the stuff from the two records that Ronnie had done with them up until that point is like, I mean, it's if you like those records, this is worth checking out. I should also say that on Live Evil, they do something really interesting in that rendition of Sign of the Southern Cross, which I'm not going to give away if you haven't heard the record. But it's like, if you went to the show, you'd be like, oh man, that was cool. That was like not what I was expecting, but what I kind of would have wanted. So that's definitely something to check out on this album. Again, I don't know for the price point whether you will find all of this worth it. You might just want to get an old used vinyl copy of one of the original pressings because the artwork is actually a little bit brighter. Anyway, it looks like they maybe didn't have the original or something, and they had to do some sort of reproduction because it's flatter also in terms of the color palette. It doesn't look like it has less dimension, but it's not glossy the way the old one was. So, you might be fine with that. You might be fine with one of the remasters. There's two now on Spotify because there's the 2008 one and then there's this one. So you might be fine with that, but I would suggest giving this album a chance and sitting with it and letting it sort of work its magic on you over time or over the experience of listening to the whole show. And you might find, like me, that you're in more of a receptive place to it. It's unfortunate that this lineup broke apart in the mixing. That just seems, and even the way they've talked about it ever since. I mean, I know Geezer Butler in 1990, when this lineup got back together, said we were acting like children then, and it certainly sounds like it. But in subsequent years, there's a quote from Geezer in Dreamers Never Die, where he's like, I don't know what happened, and then there's quotes in this that sort of contradict that, where they kind of double down a little bit on letting Dio go, and I don't know. Those quotes, some of them I'm sure have been floating around out there for a while. It's a little unclear which ones are new versus not. So it's like, it's sort of the ultimate, like, can't you guys get in a room and talk this out? And even Tony Iommi says in these new liner notes, yeah, for some reason we couldn't talk about it. We couldn't talk this through. But they kind of doubled down and they really shot themselves in the foot. They kind of like killed their career at that point, actually. If you really think about what happened here, and I really like that they went with Ian Gillan, Deep Purple singer, from their most famous lineup, Mach 2 lineup of Deep Purple, for one record, but that only lasted one record. It didn't sell well. The tour didn't do well, whereas these two albums and these tours did very, very well. And for them not to have the perspective that, man, that was a career killer for them. Sabbath soon thereafter just spiraled into complete, utter disarray, with record after record after record with all these different people and then all these reunions. And so they got back together with Ronnie for 1990's Dehumanizer, Ronnie and Vinnie. Then that only lasted one record. Then eventually in the 2000s, they got back together with him again, and they rebranded it as a Heaven and Hell so as not to confuse people, because there were intermittent Ozzy reunion tours going on at that point. And then in 2010, he passed away. There were plans to do more, but he passed away. It was nice to see that phase of their career kind of go out on a high note, even though the obviously he got cancer and that pulled the plug on that, and that felt premature as well. But they were on top and people were in demand, and there was a lot of respect around the record they did called The Devil You Know. And I've seen live footage. It's quite strong in my book. So, that's that part of the story. And I'm glad he reconciled with it, and they all reconciled with it, because there's definitely unfinished business. And when you hear this live album and hear how powerful that band could be in its prime, it's like, why would you do that? First of all, why wouldn't you just hire a mixing engineer? I mean, they had an engineer, but not somebody who like took over. That's a mixing engineer's job, is to say, okay, band people, back off. I'm going to mix this. Then I'm going to present this to you and get your feedback. And I might override you on that, because there's that old axiom. This is why bands don't mix records, because they're too biased towards their own instruments to be impartial enough to do what's actually fitting. However, I don't think the mix they did was a disaster, and I don't think the new mix corrects for necessarily whatever was deficient in the old mix.